Hi, I'm Lindsay Zafir, the editor of The Forge, an online journal on organizing strategy and practice by and for organizers. I'm excited to work with our amazing guest editors, Solana Rice of Liberation in a Generation and Candace Montgomery and Miss V. Noor of Black Visions, to bring you this special issue of The Forge, looking back at the uprisings last summer and the longer movement to defund and abolish the police and prison industrial complex. I'm here today with Darnel Joseph and Kesi Foster. Darnel is a volunteer leader with the Dream Defenders in Broward County. If you don't know, the Dream Defenders is a multiracial movement of young people organizing to build power in communities across Florida to advance a new vision of the state, one that divests from policing and imprisonment and invests in care. Kesi is the co-director of Make the Road New York's Youth Power Project, which organizes young people throughout New York City and Long Island around education justice, including getting police out of schools. We're talking about their vision for police-free childhoods, starting with the effect of the uprisings on their work over the past year. Listen in.
I think the uprisings in New York were, in some sense, they may end up being a galvanizing and unifying mechanism, I think, moving forward around efforts to defund the NYPD and police-free schools. One of those reasons is because, how the state always responds to, particularly calls rooted in Black people, pushing back against state repression and state violence, is they respond with more state repression and state violence. And you saw throughout New York that the uprisings led to violent police tactics, not just in New York City, but throughout New York State. And I think, it laid bare, the purpose of policing, right, is as an apparatus of the state to maintain this racial hierarchy. And so in some ways, I think it's possible that across New York State, we'll see that those uprisings were a moment that's going to galvanize a larger movement towards what's going to be a really, long, protracted struggle, particularly around defunding the NYPD, reducing the size, scope, and policing, and ultimately moving more people towards abolishing the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, I definitely second a lot of what Kesi just said, as well as I think the uprisings of last year definitely did a lot to activate what the word I would use, a lot of people to become organizers or be involved in it. And also build coalitions of separate organizations that kind of realize, like, we definitely need to go ahead and come together to be able to move. Because alone, if we're all going ahead, and I understand that several organizations may have their own opinions as to how we reach liberation, and that probably has been a huge crux in terms of how effective our work is singularly versus a lot of us coming together to be able to go ahead and really move forward on a path that makes sense. But our coalition alone, people were asking to go ahead and figure out how they do their own protests, right? What do they need? What do they need to go ahead and be wary of? And it's just like, all right, you need, of course, people to go ahead and chant, but you also need to make sure that you have people who are just in charge to move along the crowd. You need people that are only designated to speak to the police, because otherwise, if you have people trying to go ahead and talk on behalf of the group, that's when your message can go ahead and get misconstrued. And then all of a sudden, it's a totally different headline and the reason that you were out there, right? Like, they like to go ahead and paint this huge picture of peaceful versus disruption or a riot and things of that nature, to where if you have certain people like that just designated to be able to talk to the police, you don't even need to worry about it. People to talk to the press, as well as just people in the crowd, making sure that people are fed, have water, and just really organizing people around what it looks like to get out there and not only go ahead and fight for your rights as well as, for justice, but what it looks like to take care of the people that are with you, has probably been the biggest thing that we saw in Broward in terms of people wanting to be involved. And just looking at how to keep them engaged is probably the way out of the uprisings, and moving forward is what's dwindling down, if you will, as the Derek Chauvin case is probably going to go ahead and boost up a lot of people's engagement. Again, as you see, every time like something happens, of course, people are angry. Communities want to go ahead and go out and really fight on behalf of what they're looking for, in terms of making themselves feel better and see what else can be done that isn't going ahead and working now. But looking forward to the future to really just be like, hey, we all need to go ahead and come together as a coalition to be one in directing these people towards energy and actions that will breed outcomes that ultimately liberate us.
Something that you're pointing to, Darnel, is like that relationship between those, movement moments or uprisings, where a ton of people just kind of pour into the streets. And then there's the periods in between, where we need kind of infrastructure and institutions to sustain the energy or carry forward programs. And something we're thinking about a lot in this issue is that relationship between movements and infrastructure. So I'm curious to hear from both of you what you think the uprisings last year showed about where our movement infrastructure is weak and where it's strong. And then what work you've done over the past year to build up that infrastructure that can sustain that movement energy. Darnel, do you want to start this time? And then we'll kick it to Kesi.
Yeah, kind of like I mentioned before, something I definitely realized is that there are people who are there to join the work, right? Dream Defenders and several other people in our coalition were able to go ahead and probably put together the biggest protest that Fort Lauderdale has ever seen in the past decade. I can't tell before then, but I know for a fact 3,000 people roughly came out to go ahead and shout out with us that we're done dying. And looking at those amount of numbers, but then seeing that, as time passed and people's interests fade, the main issue where I think infrastructure needs a lot of work in is what actionable items we can go ahead and give people so that they continue doing what they're passionate about, or at least being involved in the work right after would go ahead and keep them there, right? A lot of times we go ahead and we get together for protests and people are just waiting for the next one, right? Like, when's the next protest for us to go to? Which I know someone I know and respect, she called it ambulance chasing, right? Which was totally out of pocket for me when I first heard it. But then upon further reflection, I was like, yeah, like it does somehow seem that, we're just kind of waiting for the next thing to go ahead and be angry about so that we can all come together, organize, and then see what comes after that. And that's not a fair representation of all the organizations and work that we're doing, because even in Dream Defenders, we have several things that we're working on outside of just in response to police brutality. But looking at infrastructure from that point of view is just making sure that people can stay engaged with stuff to do, right? Like, okay, you've been to this protest. Now what does it look like? Are you going ahead and you're reaching out to your friends? Are you having those hard conversations with your family to see where they're at, where they're aligned? Are you going ahead and joining these organizations that are putting together these events to be able to go ahead and say that you are ally, or like put work into actually going ahead and dismantling the systems that uphold these like racist institutions that we're all affected by? And that is probably going to be the greatest opportunity from here on out in terms of just making sure that things move forward. In terms of Dream Defenders, we've been a lot more intentional with our one-to-ones because, of course, as things have gone digital, between our own members as well as people out in the community, everything, even as this meeting is on Zoom. And with the looming threat of COVID coming around, a lot of people don't feel comfortable coming together to be able to go ahead and have those conversations and to really feel as if you're creating and building a relationship with them that's not just surface level or just like digital. So really just looking at how to go ahead and revamp that process to talk to them, to be able to understand like what their story is, how do they connect to the work, and like where they would like to go with it has been the biggest thing for us moving forward.
I mean, I think having this conversation today, right? Like, I want to acknowledge that, police departments in 2 different cities killed 2 young people, right? Like, before they even were able to reach adulthood. Adam Toledo in Chicago, and Dante Wright in Brooklyn City, Minneapolis, while most of the country and the world is watching a trial, the trial of the officer who murdered George Floyd. And so that can be sobering, right? Like thinking about the uprisings following George Floyd's murder and following Breonna Taylor's murder and so many other, right? Like people who have been killed by the state, which often leads to is the match that leads to the uprisings. As sobering as that can be, I think when we think about the uprisings and some of the, I'll say for folks organizing on the ground, some like we should claim like some of the victories, whether they be small, whether it's hard for us to kind of measure how transformative they are in the time. When you look at, the deep infrastructure that has connected organizations across the country around police-free schools, that infrastructure, that those organizing relationships, learning from each other, our challenges, our successes, our failures over the years, the sustained organizing there, that was able to, help support, folks like the Black Organizing Project that was able to, win getting police out of Oakland schools, in Madison Freedom Inc. and other organizations that had been organizing for years to get police out of schools were able to get police out of their school system. There's an infrastructure in place that made those victories possible following those uprisings. And those organizations, did amazing organizing in order to move, under the chaos of the circumstances. When you look in New York City, there's been 30, 40, 50 years of sustained organizing around police brutality and violence in our communities. Following the uprisings, we were able to help move policy repealing 50A in New York City, which is a law that's been on the books since the 1970s, which shields police misconduct, correctional officer misconduct. I think we didn't just see uprisings, right? Like we also saw the result of decades of sustained organizing and infrastructure of organizing communities, an infrastructure of, shared, of stakeholders that were able to move things during and after the uprisings. And so I think, in some sense, when we take into account the beast that we are fighting against, it can be sometimes hard to see in the moment how much progress we're making. But I think, we should take, collective breath sometimes and recognize that our organizing is moving things for our people in a way that's going to really affect material conditions for more organizing, grounded in liberation and transformation.
So one of the questions we're asking everybody is what your vision for safety is that will replace policing and imprisonment. And because, the topic of this panel, as we conceived it, as police-free childhood, I'd love to hear from the two of you of your vision for a childhood free from police, and for what that kind of, safety and liberation would look like.
In terms of like a police-free childhood, I feel like one of the biggest or quickest starts would be the removal, of course, of SROs from our schools, first and foremost, but also to take a better look at like the way carceral punishment is kind of weaved into practices in our schools as it is today, starting with the way internal suspension is held. You do something, teacher kicks you out, you're moved to a particular portion of the school where essentially you don't do anything. You sit there in silence, at least for the way I've seen it happen in schools that I've attended in the past. You sit there in silence, maybe you do work, but it's not productive, it's not transformative, it's not addressing any problems as to why they were doing X, Y, or Z, or what caused the issue within the classroom that led them there. So just going ahead and looking at those practices to be like, well, are they really bettering anything? Because I think those practices directly go ahead and address people who are still in the classroom, but not the students who are actually being removed. And it kind of forgets about them and gives them a chance to go back at a certain point, but totally glazes over the problem. Of course, when you go ahead and talk about like a police-free childhood, reducing police and replacing police with more counselors who are actually proven to be more useful in addressing issues that students and our children face than, let's say, like a cop's body slamming a 13-year-old for having an attitude, right? Like you always see these pockets of stories that happen, you know, where it's just, at least in my opinion, completely unnecessary for this amount of force to be used against someone who is roughly like a third of your size, right? And doesn't really have any power there for you to feel threatened and address the situation that way. Looking towards the future, I would love to go ahead and see more communities adopt like community-based public safety programs, right? Like Cahoots in Oregon, something that we go ahead and mention all the time in terms of like having a system that's outside of police to go ahead and address issues that arise that they aren't actually going ahead and trained to handle. And even if they are trained, they're not trained very well in terms of handling it versus someone who actually has spent years or some actual dedicated time to addressing like mental health crises and what to actually do in an emergency situation that isn't quote unquote violent or physically violent or has someone like in physical danger or harm right then and there. That's more of what my vision of safety looks like. And as well as every time now that I hear, you know, what are we going to be replacing schools? I mean, not schools. What are we going to be replacing prisons and police with and imprisonment and things of the like? It's not lost on me that it's just not really looking for a replacement, but in my eyes, actually just getting rid of it altogether, because none of these things currently go ahead and address problems that allow these things to exist, right? So my idea for replacing prisons would look a lot like expanding food programs and increasing school budgets for aftercare programs and actually going ahead and addressing homelessness. Because if it's illegal for me to be homeless, if you're going to go ahead and find me and potentially throw me in jail for not having a house and needing to go ahead and sleep outside, to where you've also somehow installed very anti-homeless structures in order for me to not be comfortable, then, you know, a lot of people who are homeless are unfortunately opting to rather go to jail because they know that there's a roof over their head. They don't have to deal with weather conditions. They're able to go ahead and have a meal, albeit not the greatest meal, but a meal that's consistently going to go ahead and come to them. And, you know, federal dollars are being spent to go ahead and keep them incarcerated, whereas they don't need to be there. If we actually went ahead and addressed homelessness, then that's one issue that's going to go ahead and go away, to be able to have less of a need for policing and prisons to even stay in the position that they currently are. So addressing with those things is what I look towards in terms of replacing policing or getting rid of the idea of imprisonment and carceral punishment in the U.S.
You hear this a lot from, you know, especially politicians, is how are we going to create safe communities or safe schools or safe hospitals or safe homeless shelters, all these places where police have been put into. What are we going to replace police with to make these places safe? And the police just murdered a 13-year-old child, right? Like murdered a 13-year-old child a few weeks ago in Chicago. The police are not making anything safer, right? Like, in fact, the police are bringing violence and all types of extraction, displacement, oppression, all types of violence in so many, which manifests in so many different ways into our community. And so it's about removing the police. And, you know, as Darnel, I think, you know, eloquently laid out, it is about creating the conditions for public goods, for public agencies, for our cities and states to provide an abundance of care to our communities, you know, whether that's in our schools, whether that's through, you know, housing, whether that's through the healthcare system. It is about removing police and all the, not just police, right? It's not police in themselves as a public institution. They're working for the state, so it's not just about removing police, but it is about creating the conditions where we're struggling over who is worthy of care in this country. And for generations and decades, since the founding of the country, whether it's indigenous people or Black people, immigrants, have not been worthy of care, and we're still organizing and struggling to ensure that we are transforming the systems that are serving people, the systems that are set up, which oftentimes means we have to dismantle them and start something new.
So this is another question we're asking everybody is, what do you feel like is being said over and over and over again, but that no one's hearing? Like, what's being said that remains unheard?
Yeah, first and foremost, police don't actually go ahead and reduce crime; they respond to it. Is something that I always go ahead and see in terms of like something that's forever being said, just how Kesi just went ahead and put out there that it's always, how are we going to go ahead, and if you remove them, what's about to happen? It's just like they're there. Right, they're there, and absolutely nothing has changed. Things arguably have only gotten worse, and if you do see a change, it's due to external factors like potentially the reducing amount of people in an area due to pandemic, and even for the places that did start opening up or had police presence, right? You clearly saw a divide in the way that people were treated depending on what type of demographic were in those spaces, right? Like, are you finding people for not having a mask on, or are you going ahead and you passing them out, right? You would see images like that of like two literal separate worlds happening on different sides of the country. And it's just continuously I hear that heard. And also another thing I kind of wanted to mention, which is even I'm kind of guilty of, but I feel like it should be said, is like the importance of building community, right? I think is, it's my favorite word, community, because it potentially means so much in terms of who you are including within that group. But in practice, I don't feel like it's really being done on like an interpersonal level, right? Like when you go ahead and you talk about community, like, do I know the first names of my neighbors, right? I feel as if when you look towards the past and you talk to elders, there was a better sense of like, so-and-so down the street is having this struggle. Like, can we all go ahead and support and do them? And you see it a lot online with like GoFundMe's of particular demographics and groups, right, that need help, right? So they go ahead and they're able to digitally support each other, but like within geographically, like your own location, right? What does that really look like? And are we going ahead and really building that type of relationship with the people who are actually around us, so that if something does happen or go down, like, are we able to go ahead and support them? Or do they believe that they're able to lean on us, or do they even know that we're around in order to be a resource to them? I think it's something, at least from what I'm seeing and where I live currently, a bigger problem that needs to be addressed and is being worked through by the organizations that are here.
I'll say, I think it's important for us to focus on what's being distorted that organizers and communities are saying, right? And so, when you look at the movement to defund the police, which I would say was amplified in the uprisings, right? But this is not the first time that Black communities have called for divesting from police departments, reinvesting and reallocating money that's going into policing and oppressing us into our care. It roots in abolishing. The roots are in abolishing the prison industrial complex, which is a call that has been around for generations and generations and generations. That's evolved into the movement now for abolition. But I would say it's important, I think, for us to think about the way in which what we're saying is distorted, right? And so the call to defund is a comprehensive, clear call that people are saying we have to divest from the power, scope, authority, and budget of police departments in this country, because these departments have been designed and set up to control, oppress, extract, displace, and exploit Black people, Indigenous people, and marginalized people in this country. But then, the distortment comes when you have, Obama, former President Obama on television saying things like defund. That's a bad slogan. If these people want someone to listen to them, they should come up with a different slogan, right? Like, that's a distortion. He knows very well what people are calling for when they say defund the police. His administration failed to do any significant reforms that would prohibit or limit what we continue to see to this day, right? So that's a distortion. When, our current president also, comes into office, saying he's gonna increase the budgets of police departments across the country through federal funding, because he doesn't believe in defund or what have you. It's a distortion, right? Like, so I think the biggest danger is, and this is really across the board when we're thinking of policing, whether it's liberal mayors of cities like Chicago and New York, or whether it's neoliberal politicians on the Democratic side or fascists on the Republican side, whatever, across the kind of political spectrum, it really is a distortion of the messaging that I think is the most, is the biggest challenge for us moving forward.
Thank you for listening. For more conversations like this one, visit forgeorganizing.org. We'll see you on Twitter @forgeorganizing. For more information on Black Visions, visit blackvisionsmn.org or follow them on Twitter @blackvisionsmn. You can find more information on Liberation in a Generation at liberationinageneration.org or follow them on Twitter @liberationin. Thank you to Nino Fernandez for post-production, audio, and editing. And thanks to all of you for listening. Take care and stay safe, everyone.